All right, the Lord is good. A stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows them that trust in him. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all your ways, and he'll direct your paths for good. Only one God and one mediator between God and man. The man, Christ Jesus, who gave himself a ransom for many. And Jesus said many. Paul wrote all. Jesus was right. So, here we are on a very interesting message on Marcion. And I did a lot of research on Marcion, and I found that people were talking about Marcion, but never quoting Marcion. And then you find out very early on that there are no writings from Marcion. There's not a single writing of this character, Marcion, which almost seems like a myth, a made-up character. But then we have the writings of Tertullian and supposedly some other people which wrote against him. So the only writings we have about Marcion are the people who criticized him and tried to disprove his theology. But he was a theologian, you might say. He was a believer in God, but he was very strange. And so I find it very strange that there's no record of any writings from anybody involved in this church. They claim this church of Marcion was prosperous, you might say, widespread for centuries. I think not. So many things could have been changed. I think if there were writings of Marcion, they were destroyed by the Catholic Church. Everything was destroyed. And so they claim it went on for centuries, but why is there no record of anything? Nothing. No record of the names of the church. What was the name of his church? And I found in all I study, I looked at everybody that was telling you about Marcion. They were all somewhat similar, but there's some differences. And they're putting it in their own words. But they never quoted any writings of, well, all you can do is quote Tertullian. And I'll tell you who he was in a minute. But they never quoted anything from Tertullian because he's the only one that I'm familiar with right now. I think there might have been somebody else, possibly. They say critics, but then all I hear about is Tertullian. You know, they claimed all these things about Marcion, but then there's no record of him. No record of his church. And so I finally blossomed in my study yesterday, which was kind of late. And I really took off in my plan on what I was going to say and what I was going to relate in this message. I'm going to find a lot more. I'm going to be a master, an expert at Marcion when this is all over. But I wrote down a lot of things. I wanted to make sure I said what I wanted to say about Marcion and Paul. It's all about Marcion and Paul, okay? So let me get right into what I wrote, because there's some great material here I have, to say the least. Nobody has this material that if you look on YouTube and even web pages. They'll just talk about Marcion, They don't quote anybody. They just talk as if they know everything about him, when obviously they don't. And they all have their own version of who he was. All right, so Marcion, I don't really care where he lived. They'll say of Sinope or whatever. Then there was another place. In another place it said of some other place. I don't care about that. So Marcion lived from 85 AD to 160 AD. So he lived to be 75. And so I wrote, Marcion tried to make the Old and New Testament as different gods, which is not a totally far-fetched idea when you consider how different the Old and New Testaments are. The only evidence there is that there would be two separate gods is that the teachings are opposite in the OT and the NT in many cases. And that's what I'm going to show you today, and I'm going to really blossom in that later on in the next message. Well, I'm going to do more. I'm going to provide, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to accumulate, but I think there's a tremendous amount. But I think I've got a lot of it right here already. And I said, because Jesus certainly never said straight out that the God of Moses was a different God from his father. Certainly not. But he didn't say God commanded all the time when quoting the Old Testament law. All the time when quoting the Old Testament law, which is suspicious. It's just suspicious, that's all. At least the translations say this. You have to go with what's written. I have to either believe it or not believe it. I can't say, well, it's all translated wrong, or somebody added this or somebody added that. No, I'm going to believe unless it's in contradiction to other things that were said, that I may doubt it, I suppose. But for the most part, I'm going to believe it, that they somehow captured what Jesus said in detail, even though there's no record of him commanding them to write down what he said. So then I go on to say here, Marcion tried to make the Old Testament God an evil God, and the New Testament God a good God. I made the G's small, and I've got some very interesting information. I don't think I'm going to get to it today about the word theos. Sometimes they use it as the small g on God, and sometimes they use it as a large G. And what I discovered was very fascinating. But I don't think I have it in here today. And then I said, and he got this from Paul of Tarsus, and so have I. In other words, Marcion tried to make the Old Testament God an evil God, and he got it from Paul, and I've seen the same thing in the writings of Paul. Big time. I go on to say, Paul said the law was evil and a bad doctrine. That's what he said. I went over this in all these different messages I did on Paul. And I said, and with Jesus, it was dead and over, he said. That's what Paul said. He says, with Jesus, it's dead and over, the law of the Old Testament. He even suggested that God was dead through the death of Jesus. That's what Paul suggested. He suggested that God was dead through the death of Jesus. And I go on to say, Marcion's theology is only known through his critics. Through his critics' books. Right here. Like Tertullian, who wrote Adversus Marcionium. Now that's the book I got a really good copy of, and I found a way to search it. And so I've got a ways to go on extracting whatever I can out of it. But it's very boring if you just try to read every word of it. I don't think I can do that. It's very hard to read. It's old. It was translated. It was old, and it sort of rambles on a lot of times. You're not even sure what he's even saying. But then sometimes you are. So I go on to say, Marcion's theological beliefs were the fruit of Saul of Tarsus and also of Plato, the philosopher, and also Gnosticism. And I had a bulk of information that I had, and it was annoying me, so I took it out and I put it in a separate document. And I may get back to it. I may eventually, if I can find confirmation of a lot of this information that I've read, that I accumulated from all these different people that were talking about it on the internet, then I will use it. But I'm not going to start talking about information about a guy named Marcion, all this information, when I can't confirm that it's true about what he said or did not say. Because a lot of statements were made about supposedly what Marcion believed. I want to see it in writing, in the writings of Tertullian or somebody else. So Tertullian, going on here, Tertullian over here, lived from 155 AD to 220 AD and was a Christian author from Carthage in the Roman province of Africa. So I figured it out. I wrote, so Tertullian was 5 years old when Marcion died at 75. So there is a big gap in time there. So I found that interesting. He was only 5 years old, and Marcion died the same year, if my calculations are correct, at 75 years old. So Marcion lived a reasonable amount of time. So I was able to get 3 quotes from the book by Tertullian, which is called Adversus Marcionium. That's one way of putting it. And so I think they're interesting. At least they are exact quotes from Tertullian, which nobody, and I mean nobody, says. They have no quotes from Tertullian or any other critic. But I'm going to come up with more too. And I don't know how good they're going to be, but I'm going to be coming up with every one that I can find. There was one book I got a hold of, a PDF. Somebody wrote a big book about Marcion. It was just terrible reading. It was just horrible. There's a lot of horrible documents. They're just terrible to read, terrible. Well, here it is. Number 1, except, this is an actual quote from the book by Tertullian, except that Marcion says, see, that's what I want to hear. Marcion says, what did he say? That his God is not an object of fear. He's claiming that his God of the New Testament is not the same as the Old Testament God. Claiming that the object of fear is not the kind of God, but the judge. See, this language is still not perfect, but you can get the idea. with whom are to be found the materials of fear, which are wrath, severity, judgments, vengeance, and condemnation. So what he's claiming here, Marcion, or what Tertullian is claiming that Marcion said, was that the God of the Old Testament, and everybody's right about this, is that Marcion said that the God of the Old Testament was a God of judgment, a God of vengeance, God of severity, God of condemnation, and that the New Testament God was not. He was a kind and gentle soul who he was just love, and he was just forgiving and loving, and that's who he was. But that's just simply not true. In fact, I'm going to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that just the opposite. The New Testament God is even more severe when you look at the right verses, even more strong on judgment, even more strong on vengeance, and even more strong on condemnation. That can be carried out indefinitely, that statement, that belief. And I would just say one thing about that, is that the doctrine of hellfire, Jesus preached hellfire. He talked about a furnace of fire. The Old Testament God didn't say he was going to put people in hellfire. Jesus said that his teachings were more extreme and more stricter and more demanding than the teachings of Moses. So the second one I have here, and this one says, when this is reported to the master of the household, he's talking about a parable. Tertullian is talking about, apparently, Marcion talking about a parable of Jesus. He's going on to say, when this is reported to the master of the household, he is moved well enough that he was moved. Well, this is what this says. Now that I'm reading it out loud, I'm realizing, and this is the way it is throughout the whole book. The writing is a little harebrained. Very old. We're talking 19 plus centuries old, this book. But then it says, for Marcion says, and this is the key, his God has no emotions. That's what Tertullian said about Marcion, that his God had no emotions. Well, that's quite a statement to make. And that doesn't sound right to me. I mean, we'd have to define emotions, and we'd have to decide, does God have emotions? And I'd say certainly. I'd say surely he does. Of course he does. So that's a false belief. And then the third one I got was, it says, yes, but Marcion says, our God's warning from heaven commanded them to hear not Moses and the prophets, but Christ. Hear him. So he's trying to defend his belief that the Old Testament is a different God and the New Testament is the supreme God. That's what a lot of people say, that Marcion believed that the God of Jesus was the supreme God from another universe, and that he wasn't the creator. What they say about Marcion and what he believed, it doesn't really make too much sense, because he supposedly did believe that the Old Testament God was the creator, but then yet he said that the New Testament God was a superior God and greater than him. So we have a God that would have created the whole universe. He admitted that, supposedly, in the Old Testament, and yet he's saying he's inferior to a God that did not create the universe. That makes no sense. That is totally nonsensical. He claimed that the God of Jesus came from another universe, and he's trying to say that the God of Jesus didn't even want people to even hear what Moses had to say. All he wanted to do is have people just listen to Jesus. And that is true, though. That is true. And so that's a good argument. You know, but yet Jesus did talk about some of the things that Moses said. Some of the things. Not everything, by any means. And there you go. So then I wrote a paragraph here. I just wrote this. But it would make things clear if it could be proven that they are two different gods. Well, it would be clear, at least. And if I were to choose the one over the other, I would surely choose, that's me, the Father of Jesus, since he said we could have eternal life or just never die. I mean, the words of Jesus are very positive. They've been much more positive than reality. And Jesus said we wouldn't have to die. All we'd have to do is believe in his doctrine. Well, nobody has gotten that, apparently, because everybody who has believed in Jesus has died. And never die is never die. I still believe it's possible, but for some reason, nobody has been able to achieve that, and I find that amazing. And I go on to say, which the OT God did not. I'm going to abbreviate with OT with a lot of this stuff. An OT God never talked much about the afterlife, except in Ezekiel 28, where he hinted about some kind of afterlife. But I do find it interesting how Jesus said and then I have a whole bunch of verses I want to read. But I want to just reiterate, the Old Testament God did not say anything about eternal life or the afterlife. Just talked about blessings that you would receive in this world. You know, no disease, or good things and bad things in this world, not in the next world. Nothing is said. That's why they say that Marcion believed that the Old Testament God was the creator of the physical universe, and the New Testament God was the creator of the spiritual universe. I don't know how, or the spirit world. I say the spirit realm. But yet there's no scripture that says anything like that. You know, he came up with that, but it's amazing how he came up with these things. And I think he got a lot of this stuff from Plato, and he got it from Gnosticism, Christian Gnosticism. So here is some interesting contradictions. Here's Matthew 5:38 through 40. You have heard that it has been said. So Jesus is talking about something written in the law of Moses. And he's not saying God commanded in the law of Moses such and such. But he's just saying it was just said by somebody, I guess. And then it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But then he says, but I say to you. So he's saying something that is the opposite of that. So you have the God of the Old Testament saying one thing, and you have the God of the New Testament. All the words were given by God to Jesus, or most of them, saying the opposite. The opposite. How can that be? How can that be that it's the same person? Maybe I'll come up with a reason for that. I haven't yet. But he goes on to say, but I say to you that you resist not evil. So this is not practical. This is not reasonable. This is not possible that you don't fight back against evil. It's very, very unrealistic. But on the other hand, in many cases, it is the best way to go. You see? So you have these different situations. If somebody is ready to hit you with their hand in the head, and if you antagonize them, they're going to hit you in the head with their hand. If you don't antagonize them, then they may not. If you get in a fight with somebody, a physical fight, somebody can get seriously hurt or killed. There's been fights between two people where they just, in the movies it shows people they just have a good fight. They say, yeah, I really like a good fight. That's BS. You can get killed in a fight. People get vicious. They break bottles and cut you. And bars, I knew one guy got in a fight with somebody and he killed him. And then I think they put him in jail for a couple of years or something. Yeah. For manslaughter because he was out of control. But he told me that he did what he did. He killed somebody in a fight. Killed him. Did. So in reality, resisting evil is a very good idea in many, many cases. But then on the other hand, if somebody does hit you in the head, then I think you need to block it and then counter-strike. It's important to block it. Because it goes on to say, or Jesus went on to say, but whoever shall hit you, I don't know if it says hit in any versions, I just changed that from the King James, shall hit you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. No, that ain't going to happen. That is not going to happen. Yeah, I really like that. Oh, you hit me on the one side. Here, try the other side. I think not. Now, you block it and you counter-strike. That's the way you do it. Now, you don't want to throw the first punch and you don't want to instigate the fight. You want to avoid it. You want to be a peacemaker. So then, we have the Old Testament. Exodus 21, 24 and 25, that says, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. There you go. That's the complete opposite. And they give examples. There's a lot of writing in just each one of these things. I've got 3 separate times that this is said in the law of Moses. But they give examples, if so-and-so does this to you and kills your cow, then he's going to replace the cow, stuff like that. If somebody kills somebody, then they need to be killed. Which I'm going to read actually down below. So, then we have Leviticus 24:1. And I put this here because it's the beginning of this chapter. I'm going to read 5 verses in the chapter. And I want to make it clear and show you that at the very beginning of the chapter, it clearly says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying. So it's very clear that God was speaking these commandments. Because sometimes there's pages and pages of laws and commandments, and you can hardly even find where it says God said, because you have to go back so many pages that you can't hardly do it. It's not easy to do. But this one was very clear. And so it goes on in the chapter, verse 17 through 21. And he that kills any man shall surely be put to death. So, this is, once again, this is the opposite of what Jesus was saying. Verse 18, and he that kills a beast shall make it good, beast for beast, like I was saying. And if a man causes a blemish in his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. You know, whatever you sow, you reap, right? Breach for breach, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused a blemish in a man, so shall it be done to him again. And he that kills a beast, he shall restore it, and he that kills a man, he shall be put to death. And that's what every single time where they can prove that somebody killed somebody, they should be put to death in this country, in any country. But yet, if it's not definite, I mean, they've got to be able to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. And sometimes all they have is DNA evidence, and I don't know if that's good enough. I mean, it could be faulty. I mean, but if they have video of somebody doing it, that person should be quickly executed. Because how often does that happen? But any case, but then you have serial killers and they admit that they do it, but they make a deal because they're going to tell them where all the bodies are hid. And so they don't put them down. They just lock them up for the rest of their life in the deal, you know. And so I suppose they don't have any choice with that because the relatives want the remains of the people that were murdered. You know, so Jesus was saying he was reversing that. He was changing it. So I don't think that's very good, you know, because I think the death penalty needs to be exacted. And so many people that have been convicted of murder, and it's very clear, the evidence is very strong, yet they're not killed. They're not executed. It's not right. So then lastly, I got one more from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 19:21, and basically saying the same thing, but it's showing that it's been reiterated. It was reiterated 3 times in the books of Moses. 19:21, Deuteronomy. And your eyes shall not pity, but life shall go for life. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So I believe, I mean, if it's an accident, then no. I mean, if somebody didn't deliberately do it, but if you can prove that they deliberately did it, then there's got to be a severe penalty. That would be a problem if it was an accident. Then they say, no, it wasn't an accident, you did it deliberately. You know, that would be a problem. But the bottom line is, one God is saying one thing, and then the other God is saying the opposite. And so I have a lot more to go on this. I'm going to develop this to the ultimate degree, to the nth degree, like they say, to the extreme degree. And we'll take it up again next week.